Ok, bom dia para todos, boa tarde para o professor Dark, que é hoje o nosso entrevistado aqui do canal. Ele tem uma série de excelentes trabalhos na área de arqueologia e história, e hoje nós vamos falar sobre o trabalho dele em Nazaré e quais foram as descobertas, né, o que ele trouxe de novidade para a gente a partir desses trabalhos. Então, eu gostaria que o professor começasse fazendo uma apresentação pessoal e depois que pudesse falar do seu trabalho de escavação no sítio de Nazaré.
Well, I'm a professor at King's College London, which is one of the main universities in the UK. And I'm there in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, although I'm not a theologian or an expert on religious studies, but an archaeologist and historian. And what I do is to use archaeological techniques and sometimes history to investigate the first 1,000 years AD in what was the Roman Empire and the areas around the Roman Empire, and try to understand, using those methods, the big questions that affect us today from that period of history. So try to understand better things that are still important about that period of history. And of course, one of those things is the origins and early development of Christianity. Today, Christianity is the largest world religion. It's a religion which is extremely important in your country and my country. Britain is still a Christian state, unlike the United States, which is a secular country, or France, which is a secular country. We have an established religion, and that religion is Christianity in the UK. So no one could doubt here, and I think no one could doubt in your country, the importance in the 21st century of the Christian religion. But why did Christianity become so important? Its theological and value system is, of course, part of the explanation. But we can look at other explanations for why the church grew and why people turned away from a religion they'd followed for centuries and became Christians. And the start of all this, obviously, as most of the people viewing will know, is back in the 1st century AD in what we today call the Holy Land, the modern countries of Israel and Palestine, and to some extent the modern country of Jordan. Now, the archaeology of early Christianity, you would think, would be extremely popular for archaeologists and extensively worked on. But you would be wrong. It's very few 21st century archaeologists who work on the very earliest Christians. And there are various reasons for that, but I'm one of them. And much of my work on early Christianity has been in what is today Israel, particularly the north of what is modern Israel, in the region of Galilee. And it's in that region that Jesus of Nazareth grew up, in the city, well, in his time, not a city as such, in the place called Nazareth, which is today a modern city in Galilee. It's in fact the largest, mostly Arab city in the north of Israel. So most of the people in modern Nazareth are what the Israelis call Israeli Arabs. They are partly Christian Arabs and they are partly Muslim Arabs, but there is a relatively small Jewish population in Nazareth compared to many other places in the current state of Israel. And also in Galilee, there's the Sea of Galilee, the large lake, which is to the north of Israel, to the north of Nazareth, and that lake, called in the Bible a sea, the Sea of Galilee, was the center of a lot of Jesus Christ's early mission work. Many of the events in the Bible are set around the Sea of Galilee. And I've been conducting archaeological work in Nazareth and around the Sea of Galilee on the early Christians and trying to understand the context and lifestyle of people in those areas when Christianity was just beginning. And so that's what I'm talking about here today.
A próxima pergunta que eu gostaria de te fazer é a seguinte: como é que as suas escavações, o seu trabalho recente de escavações em Nazaré mudou as percepções e, digamos assim, mudou o conhecimento acadêmico no mundo?
Okay, the work in Nazareth in the 21st century, which began in 2004 with an archaeological survey of the surroundings of Nazareth, has told us very much more than we previously knew about the Nazareth that Jesus lived in and about its context in the local landscape. And I shall say something about that. The first thing is that we now know that Nazareth was in a very densely populated part of Galilee. Very little was known of the landscape surrounding first century Nazareth when I began my work. We knew that there was a valley to its north, which was likely to be where most of the agricultural land related to Nazareth was situated. And across that valley, it's quite a wide valley, about 7 kilometers away, there was a Roman town called Sepphoris. Sometimes you'll hear of it by its Israeli name, Zippori, but in English, Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was quite a conventional Roman urban center. It had all the buildings we would expect of such a place, shops, elaborate houses, not so rich houses for most of the people, a theatre, various public buildings that are typical of Roman towns, even Roman temples, although most of the population in Sepphoris was probably Jewish, living under Roman rule, and exercising, it seems, a quite conventional form of Judaism, even alongside Roman paganism and alongside the way of life in the town, which was typical of many Roman provincial urban centres. So that was Sepphoris. And before my work, it was quite conventional among archaeologists and historians to assume that Nazareth, across the valley from Sepphoris, was very influenced in cultural terms, economic terms, etc., by Sepphoris. What we showed in doing an archaeological survey of the valley between them was that this was not the case. Sepphoris was very Roman in many ways, but the cultural and economic effects of that urban centre extended only halfway across the valley. In the southern side of the valley, closer to Nazareth, all those influences, if you like, stop. And in the settlements we found there, and we found that the valley was extremely densely populated in the early Roman period, in the period we're talking about. All those settlements close to Nazareth had no trace of manufactured goods or anything that came from Sepphoris that were made and produced in any way by other people than Jews. And in the Nazareth side of the valley, everything we could find, and everything anybody else looking at its archaeology has found, was manufactured by the Jewish population. So it looks as if the population in the valley, in the villages and farms in the valley, closer to Nazareth, were rejecting Roman imperial culture and probably, as part of that, not integrated into the economy of Sepphoris itself. So there was, if you like, a cultural frontier between more Roman, but still Jewish, populations in the north of the valley and very much less Roman, not Roman at all, people in the south of the valley near Nazareth. And that was not at all known before. Something else that was not known before, if I may go on, before your next question, was that there was a cluster, a group of quarries, small quarries around Nazareth. Now, quarries were known around Sepphoris to quarry the stone for the buildings, for the roads, etc. But why would there be a cluster of quarries around a small place, a village probably, like Nazareth? And the most likely explanation, of course we can't prove this from current evidence, but the most likely explanation is that Nazareth was one of a type of sites known across the Roman Empire, particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, but the whole Roman Empire really, which archaeologists sometimes call quarry settlements, which were basically farming communities, but doing a small amount of quarrying to supplement their income, to supplement the wealth they could generate from farming. And so that paints Nazareth in a different light to anything we had before. Certainly the Bible and any Roman period written sources don't tell us that about Nazareth. And of course, that's very interesting when we hear from the Bible that Joseph and Jesus were described using the word tekton in Greek. Now, tekton is normally translated in English as carpenter, and many people will have heard Joseph described as a carpenter. Well, it can mean that, and it might mean that, but it really technically means someone involved in construction, particularly in building things for any purpose. So it could equally apply to someone working stone, as you would if you were quarrying stone and making things out of it, as it could to a carpenter. So that might cast that biblical description in a new light. So that's what we found around Nazareth. If you like, I shall say a little bit about what we found in Nazareth, which was, if anything, more interesting even than that.
Não, sim, eu vou querer muito saber o que havia dentro de Nazaré. Mas antes, eu gostaria de fazer a seguinte pergunta. O senhor acabou de afirmar que provavelmente Nazaré era bastante conhecida por todo o Império Romano, por conta de ser uma espécie de assentamento com pedreira que fornecia material para todo o Império. Contudo, na Bíblia, especificamente no livro de João, capítulo 1, versículo 46, Natanael pergunta a Filipe: pode vir alguma coisa boa de Nazaré? Então, eu gostaria de saber como é que essa percepção, né, que foi retratada pelo evangelista que escreveu ali, João, como é que isso contrasta e como é que o senhor leva em conta essa percepção a partir dos seus trabalhos de escavação em Nazaré?
Well, the first thing to say is that there were very, very many quarry settlements and other quarry places in the Roman Empire. And just to be a quarry settlement, or just to be a place involved in quarrying, doesn't mean that any settlement such as Nazareth, any village, would have been well known at all. In fact, the vast majority of rural places in the Roman Empire don't make it into the records at all, don't make it into written records at all. We know of them from archaeology, but we don't know what they were called, don't know anything about the people who lived there from written evidence. From archaeology, we can tell that there were sites, were people, there were things going on, but from written evidence, we would have no trace of that for the majority of small rural places. And that's true of Nazareth. Now, Nazareth is one of the most famous places in the world because of Jesus, of course. But then it was just any old village in just another province. And the Roman Empire was very big, stretching from Britain to what's now Iraq, and from the Rhine to the edge of the Sahara. So there's no reason at all why we would expect, using, so to speak, first principles, the settlement of Nazareth to be mentioned in any written source. And that's what we find, that Nazareth becomes interesting only when Christians wish to write about Jesus, or later on when it's a place that the priests, the Jewish priests, went to after they left Jerusalem following the destruction of Jerusalem. But that was much later than the time of Jesus. The time of Jesus in Nazareth. So that absence of mention in written sources is nothing special. It seems strange to us because we all know about Nazareth. We think it's a famous place, but it's not special in first century terms.
Ok, já que o senhor sugeriu, então conte aqui para nossa audiência o que os achados internos de Nazaré mais te surpreenderam e mais chamaram a sua atenção como um pesquisador e como um arqueólogo.
So, within Nazareth, there has been very little archaeological work done. Again, this comes as a surprise to us when we think of the fame of Nazareth, but it really was a very insignificant place apart from its relationship to the story of Jesus in terms of the Roman Empire. Now, when we do come to look at the archaeology of Nazareth, there is a couple of things that are very surprising. The first thing is, we don't know how big it was. You often hear people say Nazareth was a village, it was a very small place, a cluster of houses, what we call in English a hamlet. And the Bible seems to use a word for it that strictly translated would mean city, polis. Well, so how big was it? People have tried in the past, that is to say, archaeologists have tried in the past, to work out the limits of the first century settlement at Nazareth by mapping the tombs, the Jewish tombs, known from the Roman period around the city of Nazareth, and say, well, because they would have been outside the occupied area, the settlement area, that gives us a sort of maximum limit to the settlement area. The problem is that in our work, we found, on the one hand, if you apply modern archaeological dating to the tombs known from Nazareth, they're all later than the period of Jesus's activity there. So they're irrelevant to that. But also, at a couple of sites, occupation occurred very close or even on the same site as later tombs. So there's every reason to suppose that we can't use the tombs to form a ring around the settlement area of Nazareth in the time of Jesus, even if we can later in the Roman period. So that's I think, a very interesting thing. We just don't know from archaeology, or from written sources, how big Nazareth was. And that term polis in the Bible is used for settlements of all sorts of different sizes, not just for what it strictly means in classical Greek as town. And we find that in other first century Greek sources, so that's not exceptional. Another interesting thing we found in the centre of Nazareth was a very well preserved first century house. Now, few surface built buildings are even today known from first century Nazareth. The one we identified in my work, which had been actually excavated as early as the 19th century. Well, the actual house had been excavated in the very early years of the 20th century, but the site had been excavated in the late years of the 19th century. And there's another house that was actually found by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, Israeli archaeologists, on a building site while we were working on the house that we had identified. So we now have two first century houses from Nazareth, one of which was in my project, one of which the Israelis excavated. They have some similarities to each other, but the big difference was the house that was found by Israeli archaeologists was on a relatively flat place, and so was built up with stone walls. And the house that we were looking at was on a steep slope, so was terraced back by cutting back the rock of the hillside. And understandably, the people who had done so had made some of the walls out of the rock of the hillside by cutting the rock to form the walls, if you see what I mean. So those walls, because they were purely of rock, were much better preserved than any of the other walls on both of those house sites. And so, as a consequence, much more of the structure of the house we found, or we identified, it had been found earlier, but not studied by archaeologists. Much more of the walls had actually survived, and the preservation was quite good. We could recognize a doorway through walls that were standing above head height. We could recognize a rock-cut stairway up to what was either the roof level or the start of an upper story of the building. And that is a level of preservation which you seldom get on early Roman rural sites in Galilee, or for that matter in anywhere else in the Roman provinces. So that was quite nice, and it was nice to be able to have two examples of first century houses from the settlement in which Jesus lived as a child and as a young man, and which, for that matter, Mary and Joseph and James will have lived also. So that is exciting stuff. There might be something special about the house that we identified, or I identified. We often say in archaeological projects we, because when I do this work, I work with a team. Yes, this is not the royal we. We are not making ourselves sound more important, we're referring to the team I directed. So the house that we identified, was the subject of later veneration by Christians who built a church next to it, a cave church, an artificial cave used as a church, probably in the 4th century. Then a big church over it in the 5th century, and that was used into the 7th and probably 8th centuries. And that was then rebuilt after it had fallen into disuse, probably, by the Crusaders. And again, as a big church, only to be destroyed by fire when the Crusaders lost the city of Nazareth at the end of the 12th century. So we can say on archaeological grounds that this place that the house was venerated by Christians from at least the 4th century. We don't know whether Christians venerated it before that. But we can identify the churches that the Byzantines and the Crusaders built on that site. And they were dedicated to the upbringing of Christ by Mary and Joseph, of course. When the Byzantine church, which was still used in the 7th century after the Arab conquest, was described in the 7th century, it was said that it contained in its crypt, in its cellar, the remains of a house. And that house was where Jesus was brought up. It's what later scholars call the house of the nutrition, and they call the church of the nutrition. So it is possible, though beyond the realms of archaeology, to prove that that house was believed to be the house where Jesus lived. And that, of course, as you probably know, has attracted a lot of attention from people in the media, from people in the general public, around the world since its discovery. And on average, I still do an interview for the media across the world once a week or twice a week about it. But of course, as an archaeologist, all I can say is it was a 1st century church, a 1st century house, rather, not a church, 1st century house that was used as a place where a church was built dedicated to the upbringing of Christ. So you can decide for yourself whether you think it probably was Jesus's house in Nazareth, or it was just a house in the Nazareth that Jesus would have known. In any case, as someone pointed out to me when I was in Nazareth, in the context of a Middle Eastern village in the early Roman period, it would probably be a house that Jesus not only knew as a building, but had been inside. So it is a tangible piece of evidence from what might be called Jesus's Nazareth. In fact, the title of my book, presenting this to the general public, which is now translated into Portuguese, is The Archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth.
Muito, muito, muito interessante isso que você falou. Eu gostaria de saber se existe um debate acadêmico em torno dessa evidência que você acabou de falar, né? Se existe um debate acadêmico sobre se esta é realmente a casa onde Jesus foi criado ou não, e como é que está a balança acadêmica nesse caso.
Well, to an extent there is, but there are so few people, so few archaeologists working on the archaeology of first century Christianity at the moment around the world that there isn't much of a debate over it. In fact, one of my colleagues, just retired this academic term, is probably the leading expert on the archaeology of early Christianity, certainly in Europe, Professor Joan Taylor. And Joan and I have many times debated whether the house was actually associated with Jesus or not. But I can honestly say, I can't speak for Joan, but I can honestly say that I think for myself, it could have been, but we cannot say in archaeological terms it was. It's a possibility that it was. There's nothing about the archaeology, either the date or the type of material or the type of house or where it was or what came before or what came after, that makes it impossible that it could be where Jesus grew up. But then again, without a piece of graffiti or an inscription or something like that, which would be extremely unusual in a first century Galilean village, we just can't tell. We just don't know. So that's why I say to you and your audience, you can make up your own mind whether you think it is. I'm of the opinion that it could be, but it might not be.
Ok, aqui no Brasil, essa audiência que gosta de ouvir e de ver vídeos sobre estudos bíblicos, eu poderia te dizer que a grande maioria é cética quanto à própria existência de Jesus de Nazaré como um homem, como uma pessoa. Você acha que a arqueologia, em algum momento, poderia arrumar uma prova inquestionável, definitiva, sobre a existência de Jesus?
Well, almost all historians of the Roman Empire and of early Christianity, whether they're Christians or not, around the world, in my experience, think Jesus was a historical person and that the broad outline of his life contained in the Bible is at least historical. Some, of course, consider that every detail is historical. Some would say some details maybe were added later or whatever. But the historicity, as we say, of Jesus is not seriously in doubt. On the one hand, there are the biblical sources, which we tend to think of as the Bible, but of course the Bible is, in this case the New Testament, is a compilation of a series of things written independently and at different times. And if you take those which were written within 100 years of the lifetime of Jesus, as it's presented in the Bible, we have more of these independently written sources than we have for, I think, anybody of the same social status and same professional activities in first century Galilee. In other words, just taking those sources that were later compiled into the Bible, we have more evidence for Jesus existing than we have for any other Galilean peasant existing. These were not the sort of people in the Roman Empire who we have inscriptions recalling. Most of the Roman inscriptions are either for socially important people, people in the Roman army or the Roman government. Well, Jesus, in the first century context, was not considered to be any of those. So, in fact, though it might seem a very small amount of written evidence for Jesus from first century Galilee, we have really a lot.
Ok. No seu livro sobre Nazaré de Jesus, você afirma que todo aquele seu trabalho ali, ele contraria o que os miticistas, ou seja, aquele grupo de acadêmicos que não acreditam que Jesus existiu como uma pessoa, você diz que isso é uma espécie de cala a boca deles. Você estava se referindo a alguns miticistas específicos ou você estava se referindo a miticistas de forma geral? Seems like the captions do not sound some. So I'm trying to ask in English. In your book, you quote some, you not quote people specifically, but you tell about the mythicists that there are academics that not believe that Jesus existed. Are you were referring to specific academics or in general?
The mythicists are a group of mostly American, in my experience, atheists, non-believers, who hold that the whole of the Bible is a myth, including the existence of Jesus and everything about the New Testament. Now, I actually have never met an academic specialist on this period of history who is a mythicist. Pretty much everybody who I come across, whether they're Christian, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, who are proper, as it were, academics, think mythicism is completely untenable, completely out of the question. It's not that they're militant Christians taking this opinion. Some of the scholars who discount mythicism as ridiculous are themselves atheists or agnostics, but they consider there is no academic, no logical, no factual basis for mythicism. And that is my position. I think mythicism is a ridiculous, frankly, ridiculous theory.
Ok. Então, mudando um pouco de assunto, vamos falar da sinagoga de Nazaré. No Novo Testamento, acho que especificamente no Evangelho de Lucas, é dito que Jesus abre um livro de Isaías e começa a lê-lo na sinagoga. As suas pesquisas, as suas escavações conseguiram localizar essa sinagoga?
Excuse me, the battery is running low on my computer and I'm trying to find out why. Okay.
Right? No?
Yeah. Yes, the synagogue at Nazareth. Very difficult question because, as I've said, there's not a lot of excavation being done in Nazareth. If there was a synagogue building there from the 1st century, we almost certainly wouldn't have found it, and in real terms, we haven't found it. But because most of central Nazareth has been unexcavated, it's below modern buildings, there's probably archaeological evidence lying there in the ground, but there are buildings on top of it, and those buildings aren't going anywhere. So they're not sites that we can excavate, even sites that are going to come up as construction sites that the Israeli archaeologists are going to excavate before construction, before building. So archaeologically, there could be a synagogue as a building, but it's not at all surprising we haven't found it. We would expect, really, to have found very little of what there was in the center of Nazareth. However, the American archaeologist Jody Magnus points out to me, Jody is a friend for many years, she points out to me that the synagogue in a 1st century context could just mean a gathering of Jewish people for religious purposes. It might be open air, it might be in a building of another purpose, such as a home or a barn or something, but it needn't involve a purpose-built building. So when the Bible says Jesus was reading in the synagogue, it might just mean in a gathering of people for Jewish religious worship. So what I can say is that there's a place in Nazareth called the Synagogue Church. It's a modern church. It was probably a medieval church, but it was constructed out of a medieval building that was probably in origin not a church, and the little excavation that has been conducted under it, which we didn't do, but was quite an old excavation, though it found what might well be Roman pottery, it didn't find any building at all. So there is no reason to believe that that particular site is the site of the synagogue. So many places in Nazareth and many places in Galilee, many places in the Holy Land generally, are said to be where something happened or where some building stood, but we don't really know. They could be, they really could be, but we just don't know.
Ok. A sua pesquisa revela alguma coisa sobre a ocupação de Nazaré antes do 1º século? before the 1st century. It does not show in the caption. Sorry, my bad.
Well, earlier research by Franciscan archaeologists had shown that Nazareth as a place was occupied before the 1st century. And the archaeological work by Israeli archaeologists ahead of construction in contemporary Nazareth also indicates that there was probably a pre-1st century settlement. So whether that settlement was continuous with the 1st century settlement is not so certain, but it probably was. But it's also possible that Nazareth was resettled perhaps by Jewish immigrants from further south in what is today the state of Israel, perhaps from around the Jerusalem area, from Judea. And the reason I say that perhaps from that area is that archaeologists have found many similarities between agricultural practices attested in material terms in Galilee, including the Nazareth area, in the 1st century and even just before, in the 1st century BC, from many similarities with the area of Judea. And so it's possible, I think quite likely, that people came from Judea to settle in Galilee at that time and brought with them their farming practices. So if you wanted to look at this in biblical terms, you could say, well, this might explain why people in Nazareth would have contact or family contacts with Bethlehem, which was in the Jerusalem area. But that would be building on the archaeological evidence by an interpretation which is not necessitated by the archaeological evidence. We don't have anything which specifically says people in Nazareth, people in Galilee came from specifically Bethlehem rather than from Judea generally, probably.
Eu vou te fazer mais uma pergunta que surgiu aqui no meu círculo de amizades, no qual a gente debate sobre estudos bíblicos. Dado que no seu livro você afirma que havia cemitérios próximos a Nazaré, o assentamento de judeus próximos a cemitérios não contraria a lei de pureza judaica?
Well, the burials of 1st century Nazareth from the time that Jesus was living there, strangely enough, have not been found. We do not know any 1st century, early 1st century burials. Later 1st century tombs we do have in the Nazareth area. So this is not surprising. Again, they almost certainly simply haven't been found. But the proximity of burial and settlement in later 1st century Nazareth, yes, is surprising in view of the Jewish religious laws about burial, But it's not surprising when you look at the archaeology of other Jewish villages in Galilee, where sometimes the burials are really very close to the settlement area, closer than you'd expect from written evidence about the Jewish religious laws. Even more surprising is we have evidence that settlements or buildings, when they went out of use for occupation, could be used, or at least not so much the buildings used, but their immediate vicinity could be used for burial. So, for example, at the Sisters of Nazareth site, the site with the so-called House of Jesus that I was talking about earlier, there the house is evidently disused. This is in the 1st century. The house is disused. The house site is used for small-scale quarrying. And then, after the quarrying, long after, presumably, the house, but still within the 1st century, a burial is cut into the same site, partially cutting through the house and cutting through a bit of the quarrying. And it's those intercutting features, archaeological features, which give us part of the evidence for the sequence of house, quarrying, burial. But even the burial seems to have been in the 1st century. That sequence, though, doesn't contravene Jewish religious law. I've run this past, as they say, 3 experts on 1st century Jewish religious law, and they all really top experts, academic experts, and they all concur that that sequence would not contravene Jewish religious law on burial as it was understood in the 1st century.
E sobre o fato de Nazaré ser centro de peregrinação. Essa peregrinação começa a partir de qual século, de acordo com a sua pesquisa?
Well, Nazareth seems to have become a pilgrim center, at least from the 4th century onward. We don't really know whether Christians visited places like Nazareth in the period before Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor, made Christianity legally able to be openly practiced in the Roman Empire, and with a certain amount of state support. But recent work, in fact, again, I'm embarrassed to say my own recent work, has identified a small number of sites, including Nazareth, in which there are hints of pre-Constantinian, that is to say, pre-Constantine the Great, pilgrimage activities. And the interesting thing about this group of sites, there aren't very many of them, I think 6 very probable ones. There are a few more that could be included. The interesting thing is that they are each dedicated to, in later but still early Christian periods, to different episodes in the Bible. So you get one for the Annunciation, or Annunciation if you like, one for the upbringing of Christ, one for the Sermon on the Mount, one for the burial and resurrection, and so forth. And if someone was going to use them as pre-Constantinian pilgrimage sites, as I think they did, one would be able to travel between them, reenacting, if you like, physically participating in the biblical story of Christ. And that seems to be a pattern which predates Constantine the Great. And so if that is correct, it would be evidence that Nazareth and other Christian pilgrimage sites, but not all Christian pilgrimage sites in what's today Israel, did have an antiquity back beyond the early 4th century, and potentially back into a period when the locations of those events could have been remembered by local people. And so that's, of course, very interesting, both from an archaeological point of view and from a point of view of Christians wishing to locate those events in the modern landscape.
Uma dúvida que me surgiu agora, já que você falou aqui de lembrança, como é que a arqueologia lida com a tradição oral?
Well, in recent times, there's been a bit of a revolution in the archaeological attitude to oral tradition. Before the latest anthropological and archaeological research on the non-written transmission of topographical information, it was widely assumed by archaeologists and social anthropologists that memories could not be transmitted by word of mouth for more than, at most, 200 years, or yes, that sort of time. But recently, work by anthropologists and by archaeologists, sometimes separately, sometimes in combination, mostly in Australasia and the Americas and in Africa, has made us think again about how long memories can be transmitted by word of mouth. And so these days, and again, funnily enough, this is a major topic of my current research. These days, we are beginning to think that popular stories transmitted over generations, particularly in pre-industrial societies, though not necessarily only in pre-industrial societies, could be actually valid indicators of where things were and what things meant in the past. And so that's a very, very important area of current research. But that is a matter of really the latest archaeological and anthropological research on that sort of thing. That's ongoing research. And in fact, I'm just writing a paper on that very topic, writing up a lecture I gave to the Royal Anthropological Institute on that subject. Royal Anthropological Institute, as you might expect, is in London. And there, the audience of anthropologists was extremely receptive to the idea that archaeologists could use this kind of information in a way that we really didn't think was going to be possible until recently. But of course, it has to all be done in a very critical, logical, and academic way. You can't just say people because people say it's there, it was there, or because somebody in the 14th century said Jesus went to this mountain, he went to that mountain.
Ok, a gente está aqui superando a faixa de 1 hora de entrevista e eu, obviamente, gostaria de agradecer imensamente a esse momento que você concedeu aqui para a audiência brasileira e gostaria de encaminhar a nossa entrevista para um final com uma pergunta um pouco insidiosa, que é a seguinte: você gostaria de dar alguma espécie de spoiler de algum estudo que está sendo feito neste momento e que seria bem interessante ou bastante impactante para nós? Sorry, the captions was cutted again. I was only asking for a kind of spoiler of studies being produced right now that are very impactful, very important, and we probably will be interested on.
Well, the work that I've been doing is cross-cultural and mostly on topics that are not related to early Christian history. So, for example, I've been drawing together for this work on tradition and topography, studies done on, for example, Australian Aboriginal understandings of the past landscape, where, for example, in the Northern Territories of Australia, another scholar, no, not me, has recognized that where in a very dry inland landscape today, local people, indigenous people, have said for centuries that there was an ancient coastline and have identified characteristics of that ancient coastline. Modern geology and geomorphology has proved that there was exactly the same coastline in exactly the same places as that these local people, indigenous people, have always said, have within modern records said that it existed. But if that was the case, it existed thousands of years ago. And the only way they can have known this, because they were not writing things down, would be if they'd passed across many generations the knowledge that these particular topographical features, these cliffs or bumps in the ground, or, dried up rivers, had once been part of that coastline. So evidence like that from around the world suggests that people can remember topographical information and transmit it through generations without writing. That's just one example. In my lecture, which is actually online, you can get it from the Royal Anthropological Institute website. It's I think a YouTube broadcast of my lecture. I draw together many examples of this kind of thing from all over the world, suggesting that the spoken transmission of topographical information and potentially other information can, under specific circumstances, not all under all circumstances, preserve information, even detailed information, for many hundreds, if not, in exceptional cases, many thousands of years. If that was true, and several people, apart from me, are arguing in the academic world for it being true, that would be extremely important for many areas of history and cultural knowledge, literally worldwide, from the truth of Homer's writings through to, in Britain, Celtic stories about the Roman invasion, but written in the 13th century, to, as I've said, the pre-contact, so-called Pacific. And doubtless also of value to archaeologists and historians working em Brazil.
Ok. Dado que a minha audiência específica tem muito interesse em estudos bíblicos, você teria algum acadêmico, colega ou alguma pessoa que você simplesmente admira para me indicar? Vou falar de novo. Você teria algum acadêmico, amigo ou não, que você admira para indicar para ser entrevistado aqui comigo?
Well, I haven't applied this yet to anything to do with biblical studies, and nor of other scholars, but obviously the implications, if that sort of principle of transmission of information is allowed, is considered credible for biblical studies, would be very considerable. It would suggest that people might, for example, have remembered the very detail of Jesus's life in Nazareth or in Jerusalem for far longer than is usually assumed, and it would impact, so to speak, on the credibility of biblical events, sayings in the Bible, particular topographical details, potentially, and I'm not saying we're at that point at the moment, but it could impact on those things, on the credibility of them. very, very profoundly, and it could be a major new tool for understanding the historicity of the Bible, and indeed for theologians working on the Bible. But I'm not a big biblical scholar.
You're not a biblical scholar, but you could recommend me other biblical scholars that you trust, admire, to be interviewed here in my channel.
Oh well, you could start off. You could start off with Joan Taylor, who I mentioned. She is still, I think, contactable via King's College London. She's a very nice lady and a friend and a brilliant scholar. She's just written a book on the boyhood of Jesus, in which she has some very interesting ideas about how knowledge about Jesus's childhood could have been passed through the broader family of Jesus into later generations. Another person is Professor Helen Bond, who is at Edinburgh. She is a leading expert on the Gospel of Mark, and she is also a very interesting scholar who, like me and like Joan, has done a lot of media interviews, and so I'm sure would be amenable to being approached. There are a couple of examples from the UK. There are many such people, I think, in the United States, and probably in Northwest Europe as well.
Ok, então eu gostaria de pedir suas considerações finais sobre a nossa entrevista.
Well, it's been very interesting to speak to you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience. It's something I really appreciate.
Ok, agradeço imensamente a sua disponibilidade e acredito que a minha audiência vai adorar ouvir a sua entrevista. Foi uma pena não termos feito ela em formato de live, mas acredito que isso não atrapalhou e nem irá atrapalhar a interação aqui com a minha audiência. Professor Dark, muito obrigado pela sua entrevista. Professor Dark, thank you a lot for your interview. I'm very glad to guest you here, and thanks for your recommendations.
Well, thank you. Shall we call it to an end now?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know whether you could do that.
Yeah, there is a button, a button that has a red X. It is go out to the stage.
I can't see a red X. Okay, so I shall shut this down. Thank you again. And, if you ever want me to speak on any other occasion, I'm happy to do so.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Pessoal, semana que vem, no sábado, dia 15, às 8 da noite, teremos uma entrevista com o Dr. Douglas Carneiro. Falaremos sobre o apóstolo Paulo e sobre as pesquisas do Dr. Carneiro acerca desse personagem. Não percam! Gostou desse vídeo? Então deixe seu like e se ainda não é inscrito, inscreva-se. Um grande abraço e até mais!